Hi folks, Harry Frank from Gray Machine here, and in this tutorial I'd like to do a little breakdown of some of the visual effects I worked on for the short film Proximity. Now if you'd like to take a look at this film, go to the YouTubes at youtube.com/filmriot. There's a lot of great stuff here, but if you scroll down there's a whole section about proximity. You can watch the film itself. There's a number of behind the scenes, making of, breakdowns, all kinds of interesting stuff about the film. But I wanted to do a little bit of a detailed breakdown about the actual ins and outs of getting the shackle lights, which is what I did. So pivotal to this story are these props that were built. These are shackles that go around the ankles of the characters, and they are paired up. And if they are close proximity, the lights are green. If they start to move apart, they turn yellow, and then if they get too far apart, they turn red, and bad things happen. In fact, a lot of bad things happen. Here's a lot of fighting and all kinds of stuff. So if you watch this film, make sure your kindergartner isn't around. My part in this was to work on the lights. So although the shackles themselves are practical, the lights themselves are not. It just wouldn't be practical to manufacture something that illuminates with enough power and dealing with changing batteries, making remote controls that switch these things from one light to another while timing and acting and directing and all kinds of complicated stuff needs to happen. So although these were tricky, they're not impossible, and probably easier just to do it in post than it would be to manufacture a way to control this during shooting. Plus there was a tight turnaround time for shooting. So the visual effects. Let's just start with a very simple one here. A lot of them are like this, kind of close up, showing a shot straight on of the shackle itself, and it changes from either yellow to green or yellow to red or whatever. So let's talk about a philosophical approach. Proximity. Film Riot has a pretty big following. In fact, you can see right here, almost 500,000 people are subscribed to just the YouTube channel itself. So there's a lot of people that watch this stuff, and a lot of these people are filmmakers and visual effects artists. That's kind of the focus of of what Film Riot does. So making these things an obvious effect that some people might be familiar with and connected with, the instant somebody is connected to an obvious plugin like No Light Factory or optical flares or something like that, they become disconnected from the story. It becomes obvious that it's a post-production effect or a visual effect, and that it wasn't practical. And then at that second, they're already pulled away from the story and their connection with the film. So my job as the visual effects artist is to make something that looks real to a point where people aren't going to think about it. So it needs to feel real, but not feel like an effect, even though we're kind of building an effect here, but we want it to not look like an effect. So we want it to feel real and not effecty. So well, how do we do that? Well, we keep it simple. We don't layer any crazy effects on there. We stick with basic shapes, colors, and blending modes to get the realism that we need. So the overall approach is that these are solids. We just have yellow or green solids. I track the data. I connect that to a null object, and then I connect the solids to the null, get the shapes in place, and do some subtle feathering and glows to get these all looking good. Now that's kind of the breakdown that was already described in one of the breakdowns here. So I wanted to do a little bit more detail. So I am going to be tracking these using Mocha, and I like to do, well, at least for these, or well, I should say most of them, I used Mocha. And the reason I did that is because, well, what I need to do is track a flat plane surface. I need to track the position, scale, and rotation of it. This is exactly what Mocha does best. So although I could do 2-point tracking in After Effects, track 2 points, create the rotation and all that kind of stuff, this is what Mocha does best. So let's leave it with Mocha to do what Mocha does best. So with the clip selected, I'll go to Animation, Track in Mocha AE. So we're going to create a new project. I'm going to change the name of this so I don't overwrite the work that I did before. Call this 2. It's pretty short, 13 frames. You can see 0 to 13. So simple start here. I have my preferences set to cache the images into RAM. This just keeps things moving a lot quicker. Now if you only know 2 quick keys in Mocha, like me, those two keys, I think, should be Z for zoom in and out, and X for moving around. These will get you pretty far. So I'm going to zoom in and pan around and focus where I'm going to be tracking, which is this light right here. In fact, I'll select a little bit of this green one too. So I've got my layer selected here. I haven't renamed it, but that's fine. All we're going to do is a basic track. So I'm going to click track, and we'll go to export tracking data. And I want the After Effects transform data. So it's anchor point, position, scale, and rotation. Copy that to the clipboard. Go back to After Effects and create something to paste it to. I'm going to use a null object. I'm going to rename this so we stay organized here. Rewind to the beginning by hitting home and pasting that tracking data. Now, if I hit U to show my keyframes here, we'll see that we've got anchor point and position. When we paste anchor point, that's great for stabilization, but we don't need that. We just need the movement. So I'm going to uncheck the stopwatch here, or the time vary stopwatch. We just don't need that. So I'm going to zero that out, zero out X and Y. So we should see the null locked right where we tracked. So now we need to lay in some solids to make this stuff light up. So I'm going to create a yellow solid that's 100 by 100. Now, I'm not going to worry about the color right now. I'm going to use an effect to generate the color because, well, if I'd like to adjust this color and set my blending modes and my feathering and all that, and then tweak the color, I find it a lot easier to do this with an effect rather going to Shift Command Y, adjust the color here with all these windows in the way, and then hit OK, and then hit OK every time I want to make a tweak. So what I'm going to do is go to Effect, Generate Fill, lay in the color like that, and set this to our yellow. And I'll come back to that, and we'll adjust that as we need. So to get this to blend, I'm going to go to my blending modes. I'm going to set this to Add. Generally, when we're working with light sources and we want light to mix with something, we're going to use an add blending mode. It's going to make it lighter and blend, basically, blend the way light blends and adds. Now, that said, we can pull down the opacity quite a bit. In fact, I'm going to bring this down to maybe 20, and that still might actually be high, but we'll come back to that. And I'm going to rotate this into place. I'm just using the arrow keys to nudge this around, plus and minus keys on the keypad to rotate. And let's get this parented to the tracking null. Zoom in one more. Let's zoom into 200. Scale this up just a little bit. It's a little taller than it is wide. There we go. So this should be tracking and moving with it. Pretty much. We're doing pretty well. Now, so we don't want this to look like an effect. These are filmmakers that are watching this, so we don't want anything that distracts us from what's going on. So I'm going to use a mask feather and feather that to create much of the glow effect. So I'm going to go up here, select rounded rectangle tool. And the reason I'm doing this is because the prop itself, let's just make this a little brighter. The prop itself has rounded rectangles in there. So I'm going to match that shape as best I can. So I'll draw this rounded rectangle. To tweak the shape of the rounded rectangle, I can hit up or down on the arrow keys to match that shape. Now, you might notice that things are overall a bit dark and drab with this shot. This is done on purpose. We shoot film. Let's hide this background there. We shoot film or video, or shoot films on video or on some sort of digital acquisition, and we shoot them flat so that we have maximum amount of flexibility in the post-production process to color grade these, and one of many, many color grading applications. But to start out, we want sort of a flat image. Now, this doesn't look very exciting, and it can certainly create challenges for visual effects because we're not actually seeing what this is going to look like. Now, catch-22 is we're not going to see what this is going to look like till it's done, but the film's not going to be done till we deliver the visual effects to the filmmaker, and the filmmaker does the grading from there or brings it to a colorist. So we kind of have to fake it as best we can. So I'm going to create an adjustment layer. Well, I'm just creating a solid that is size of the comp. Let's not make this a distracting color. In fact, I generally use gray for my color correction layers. And I'll call this my temp grade. Size of the comp, hit OK, and we want to make this an adjustment layer. Or I could just go up to adjustment layer, new adjustment layer right there. I tend to make a solid and then turn it into adjustment layer. I don't know why. That's just what I do. So to this, I'll apply curves from color correction. And let's just kind of zoom out, look at the whole image, give it some more contrast. Just start with the basic S curve. And bring this middle up. And this will greatly affect how our visual effects are going to look. This will affect how bright and how saturated we want this light to appear. So we really need something temporary in place. Now, ideally, we can call the filmmaker and ask for a temporary grade, some sort of LUT that we could apply via effect utility. If you go into effect utility, or actually, I just go up here and search for LUT. Red Giant has a LUT tool, as well as After Effects has a built-in apply color LUT. So if we ask for a LUT or lookup table, it should be the color information used to grade something. You can say, send me a temporary LUT so I can apply it. But sometimes filmmakers don't always have time to sit down and work out that LUT and send it to you. So I took my best guess on this, and this greatly helped visualize how the effects are going to look after color correction. So let's get back in here and start creating a realistic blend for this light here. So I've got my mask on here. In fact, I'm going to double click on that mask and bring it into, just bring it a little bit so it matches that shape a little bit better. Now here's where the subtleties really start to help. So I'm going to hit MM, show all of my mask options here, and I'm going to work with the mask feathering and the mask expansion to make this look a lot more realistic. So I'm going to bring the feather up. Now it's going to spill outside of the mask area, and we're going to see a little bit of clipping where that mask reaches the edge of the solid, but that's fine. So what we're going to do is go to the mask expansion and bring that in. We're going to use a negative value for the mask expansion. So this does a couple things. We've got our feathering on the mask, and then the mask expansion gives us a bit of trailing towards the edge, where if you look at the lights themselves, it kind of angles away from the camera and starts to get a little bit thinner over on the sides. And if there was some sort of LED or something in there, it probably would illuminate more from the center than it would on the edges. So I felt that this made it look a lot more realistic to have those edges starting to be a little bit darker than the rest of the image. Now this is pretty close. Again, we can probably tweak this to look a little bit more orange. So I'll go in my hue here and bring this over just a couple degrees to get a little bit more orange. And then also apply a glow, a very subtle glow, not a heavy glow. We just want something that gives a little bit of punch to this to make it feel totally illuminated. So let's go to Stylize Glow. Bring this threshold up so we're processing less of the image. Bring the radius up to spread that glow out, and bring this intensity down. Again, we don't want it to look like an obvious blown out effect. We just want it just to the point where we notice that we're getting some glow right there. So what we ultimately want, we want it to blend, we want it to feel mixed with the original image, and we want to see the subtleties, especially that film grain. So if I zoom in here, we can see that film grain. In fact, I can still see a little bit of that edge of the solid. So let's expand that back in a little bit more. So this shot says right here that it's actually a green to yellow shot. So let's move this to the middle. So this is actually should be the second part. And we want a green one. So I'm just going to duplicate that, change the name of the solid to the green green solid. Actually, this should be green light. Green light. Change this just for reference. Make this green. I should name this first one green, yellow light. I like to stay organized. Green light and yellow light. So let's bring green light back. Click on the fill color, make this green. And I need to move this over so it's actually aligned with the green light. This should still be parented, so if I move this around, should still be tracking, which it is. I need to bring this in. Actually, now if I click on this edge to scale it in a little bit, because I like to scale this in the X, it's going to grab that mask, so I'm going to hit M to show my mask and lock that mask. So now I can just grab on the handle there on the side and bring it in a little bit. There. Now, because it's skewing and angling away from the camera just a little bit, I might want to do something like distort transform and do a skew. Skew would be like that. So as it angles away from the camera, I can skew it a little bit. I don't want to start grabbing mask handles and moving them around because I have these rounded corners, and I just don't want to distort it like that because that would look unrealistic. Now, in general, I found that the green tends to be a little hotter than the yellow for whatever reason. I don't know why. I would think yellow would appear more illuminated with same settings, but if we notice, our opacity is 20 for both, and I feel that like the green could actually be toned down quite a bit. So I'm going to bring this down more to like 15. There we go. Now that's one of the easy shots. I mentioned there's about 36 shots, and they weren't all this easy. So let's, now with a little bit of detail under your belt, let's look at some of the other types of shots that were in here. Now, a lot of them were just these kind of straight on tracking shots where it switches from one color to another. So this one has a little bit more motion than the last one. Again, track this with Mocha, split it in the middle from green to yellow. This one, because the shot's a little bit closer, I did just a very, very subtle shape layer on this yellow one because the camera is a little bit close, and I added just a very, very faint kind of ghosting flare using a shape layer and using a color that's just a little bit different than the shackle light itself, because flare elements rarely tend to be the actual original color. But again, very, very, very subtle. Let's move to another more complicated shot. So on the opposite end of the spectrum of these various effect shots, some of these were very far away. There's no possible way to have these tracked. So this is early on in the film. These guys are basically paired up in proximity. They should be staying in close proximity to each other, but they aren't. They're actually running off in different directions. Shackles are starting to turn yellow, and eventually they turn red, and then bad things happen. So to get this one done, there's no possible way we'd be able to actually track this. So starting with our shot here, let me pull the temp grade that I did for this shot. Should be this one right here. Steal that. There we go. Let's zoom in. So I'll just do a few frames of this. So we know we can't track it. So right here, as you can clearly see, the shackle is right there, and there should be a yellow light right about there. I don't know if we actually can, no, we can't actually see it from in any of these frames, but we kind of have to fake it. So what I'm going to do is throw a null in here, not a camera, a null object. There you are. Let's put that right there where it should be. So right on the center of the back of the ankle, that's where I'm going to call the position for that light. So I'm going to hit P and R for my position rotation, set keyframes, or I could just hit Option P and Option R to set keyframes. Now, last thing you wanted me to do is sit here and do this, but let me talk about the basic idea of getting this running motion to match is that obviously we're going to want to match the position. we're going to want to, even if it's invisible and not pointing at the camera at all, we still want to locate where the light should be so that in the frames surrounding it, we get that corresponding motion blur. So as it moves, what I did was follow the extrapolation of the basically the vector, the direction of his leg. So this leg points in this direction. So it should, if it were to continue, it would continue along this line right here. And that's where I align my null. So if it angles upward, I would go up here, hit W to rotate, and V to select it. So do that for a while, and then you have your position for your light, and then we can simply just lay in a very small light that's 10 pixels, but 10 pixels, if that. Actually, this would probably be a lot smaller, a lot less opaque. We would definitely do less glow and fading, but in fact, there's so much stuff, it becomes hard to actually see what we're trying to comp in. There it is. Now, we're definitely going to want motion blur. Turn on motion blur there and motion blur there. And then there, you can barely even see it. So here, I would probably want to tone down that motion blur by going to my comp settings, advanced, and turn down this shutter angle. I found that for the camera settings in this film, shutter angle of 90 to bring that motion blur down, and a shutter phase, so it's basically like the manual offset of the motion blur, that seemed to work. Now, I kind of cheated this up a little bit in terms of its opacity, probably because it's far away from the camera. We really need to pump up that opacity to get it to look realistic. In fact, even if you knew the shackles were not practical and done in post, you probably didn't even notice on a lot of these shots where if the shackles were remotely visible, that all of the lights were actually laid in for these. So that's a less less simple one. So some of these were more complicated like this, where we had to manually, and quite manually, track these by hand. Some were simple tracking challenges for Mocha, something like this where it bounces down. This was simply, there was really no consistency from one frame to the next. This thing just really kind of bounced, and the position of the lights was different on each frame. So you'll notice that there's no null object at all. I simply just took the shapes and just manually moved them for each frame. Now, some shots like this were a little bit in between, where I could track a few frames, but then things started to get crazy, and I had to take over and start doing things manually. So this one, there's a point at which where we start right about here, where I could go into After Effects and manually, or I shouldn't say manually, but use the After Effects tracker just to do a basic tracking of the motion. So I could go in here, select this area, and have it automatically track maybe 10 frames or so. I can keep clicking along. Oops, looks like it lost track right there. Maybe I need a little wider area out here, so it's going to look for this image as far as the confines of this box right here. So let's keep hitting analyze forward. So as we keep doing this, this will work until we start to have trees run in front of the actors. But you'll notice, if I select this null object, that even when trees pass in front of the lights, that I still kind of take my best guess as to where the shackles would be. Because like I mentioned, this is important to get the motion blur matching on the frames afterwards or before it. So there's a lot of time spent on this, the visual effects of this film, simply doing the manual tracking, going in here and simply nudging nulls around position and rotation from frame to frame to frame. and staying up late nights and listening to a lot of angry music. So that's really about it. One of the last shots right here had all 3 lights blinking in unison. So I had all of them. Well, it actually starts out with red, and then it goes to all 3. So I've got all 3 laid in, and they start to blink. Now, I was given a reference for this, and the reference had them blinking every 2 frames, and I didn't feel like doing this manually. So I set the opacity for 1 for the yellow. Set an expression here. So if we turn the current time in seconds into frames, so we just have a running count of where we are in frames from 0, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, etc. And we time to frames of the current time. Forget this part for now where I subtract a quarter. And then we use a function called modulus, which is when we divide something, it gives us the remainder. So essentially what modulus does is give us a repeating pattern of numbers. So if I, down here I can say if it's less than 2, output the value of 0. If it's not, put out the original value. So my original value is 22. So basically every 2 frames, it either goes to 0 or to the original value. This offset right here is simply offsetting the time a little bit, so when these layers start, they start with their opacity off. That was just, I was actually just following the reference that I was given, because I bumped it a little. Or I'm sorry, it starts with them on. So the red light's on, and then all 3 lights turn on for 2 frames, and then they start to blink every 2 frames. So that's really about it. It's a simple breakdown of the visual effects. I was really happy to work on this film. There's a lot of challenges, a lot of things to think about in terms of, keeping them simple, but making it look real and keeping it real. So my name's Harry Frank. I really appreciate. So my name's Harry Frank. Thank you so much for watching.